So Ahsoka. This was probably the live-action Star Wars show that I was most looking forward to, and man, it's a massive disappointment. Ahsoka had so much potential to be great. The main character of Ahsoka was perfectly cast with Rosario Dawson. The story would be written and mostly directed by Dave Filoni, the supervising director on Star Wars Clone Wars and co-creator of Star Wars Rebels, some of my all-time favourite Star Wars content. On top of that, we were finally going to get a live-action portrayal of fan-favourite character Thrawn, played by his voice actor from Rebels, Lars Mikkelsen, another great casting choice. So yeah, things were looking up. Then we started getting the trailers, and man, after the train wreck that was Kenobi and Boba Fett, things were looking to be getting back on track for Star Wars, at least on the TV side. The trailers were showing off some new interesting villains, some recognisable locations from Rebels, like the World Between Worlds and Lothal. So yeah, you could say I bought the hype for Ahsoka. It had all the elements to get me on board. So how could a show with as much going for it as Ahsoka go so wrong in the end? Well, like Kenobi and the Book of Boba Fett before it, it's the writing. The writing is just weak, and in a lot of places just outright nonsensical. And man, that's the last thing I thought I would have to worry about with Ahsoka, considering that this was being written by the guy who wrote the Siege of Mandalore 4-parter for Clone Wars Season 7. This video won't cover each episode of Ahsoka, it just really covers the problems I had with the show. So let's get into it. For me, the crack started showing pretty early on, like within the first 10 minutes of episode 1. So we open with Ahsoka gaining access to this temple to search for a star map device that presumably holds the location of Grand Admiral Thrawn. All's going fine right up until she finds it and then runs smack bang into these droids who are just waiting outside for her. Ahsoka gets the upper hand and takes 2 of the 4 of them out without any real problem. And then we run into the first massive example of how just sloppy the writing can be in this show. For context, these droids that Ahsoka is fighting with here, they belong to Morgan Elsbeth, who is also, as you might have guessed, looking for the star map device that Ahsoka has just now found. So the final 2 droids initiate a self-destruct sequence, and I mean, just look at this. Why would you send in droids that are capable of this to retrieve a sensitive device, which by the way there is only 1 of? Let me ask you a question. What would Morgan Elsbeth do if this explosion killed Ahsoka and also destroyed the star map device as well? Where would that leave her, and also her plan to find Thrawn? Kind of seems like her whole plan is kind of hinging on getting that device back intact. So when I say that the writing for this show is weak and nonsensical at times, this is what I'm talking about. Why did Morgan Elsbeth deploy these droids in particular to stop Ahsoka and retrieve the star map device? These droids are equipped with, from the looks of the explosion, a thermonuclear payload, something like what the Predator uses when it's been defeated. And Morgan Elsbeth sent in not 1 but 4 of them, just to make sure that if somehow this critically important device that her whole plan hinges on isn't atomized in 1 explosion, the other 3 explosions will surely do it. So why use this particular type of droid for this scene? Well, if I had to guess, this decision was probably driven more by Filoni wanting to have a big explosion in the first episode, more than he wanted the actual scene to make sense. If you're going to put something like this in an episode, it has to make sense with the overall story. And this kind of thing, this is something you're going to see a lot of in Ahsoka. Creative decisions not made because they make any sense to the overall story, but because Filoni wanted to have an action sequence or a set piece. And believe it or not, this isn't the only time that the use of droids makes 0 sense in this show. In episode 2, Morgan Elsbeth has one of these droids stay behind from an earlier ambush to kill Ahsoka in Ezra's old house on Lothal. And I'm not sure why Elsbeth thinks that this 1 droid alone would be able to handle that task, even with the element of surprise, when previously 4 of them didn't pose any real threat to her. Here's the thing, droids don't typically pose much of a threat to a Jedi one-on-one. That's why you pretty much always see a Jedi fighting more than 1 of them at a time. It's more the sheer amount of droids that makes them dangerous. I mean, if I wanted to kill Ahsoka here, I'd probably send in a Force sensitive to do it. Maybe this guy, since he actually poses a threat to Ahsoka and won't be immediately cut in half like this droid. Hey, you know what? Maybe I'd have this droid, who looks like the same model as the ones Ahsoka fought in the first episode, just wait up in the rafters here, all stealthy like, and not engage Ahsoka at all. Just sit up there with that nuclear bomb in its chest already armed, primed to detonate the second it sees her. That would have been a way better use of this droid and would have actually made a lot more sense in the context of this scene. This is where you deploy these droids, when you want to make absolutely certain someone is dead, and not say when you're trying to retrieve a highly sensitive device that your whole plan hinges on. To answer my earlier question, why would Morgan Elsbeth only send in 1 droid to ambush Ahsoka? You see, the real purpose of this droid isn't really to ambush Ahsoka at all. Oh no, this droid has another much more important task to accomplish, and that's to push the story along. Because this failed ambush will give Ahsoka a lead where she otherwise wouldn't have one, to Morgan Elsbeth's factories on Corellia. So we skipped ahead to episode 2 so I could finish my point about the droids and how the way they're being used in this show makes absolutely no sense. But let's just jump back to episode 1 again and talk about that cliffhanger. So at the tail end of the first episode, Sabine and Shin have a duel, and then Sabine gets run straight through with a lightsaber, and then cut to credits. This action is definitely going to have some long-term repercussions on Sabine, that's for sure. Next episode, she's fine, honestly, just totally fine. Barely any pain at all actually. No long-term injuries, nothing. Here it just looks like she woke up from having her tonsils out, and not from, say, just being run through with a lightsaber, which from what we've seen in this series has always meant almost instant death. We don't see Sabine recuperating over the next few episodes. She doesn't look to be any less of a fighter after it. She doesn't even mention it again. The next few episodes she's just running and jumping around, not a bother to her. It's almost like this whole thing, the whole scenario of Sabine getting stabbed, had absolutely no impact or bearing on the character or the overall story at all. You could even go as far as saying that Sabine getting run through was only in the story to facilitate a cliffhanger ending to an episode and nothing more. You could say that, if you were cynical. Not me though. Man, getting run through by a lightsaber means absolutely nothing now in Star Wars. A character gets stabbed, don't even worry about it. You can just use force healing to make that injury go away, or even just general medicine. Apparently that does the trick just fine. You don't even need a Bacta tank anymore. It's fine, just forget everything you've seen done with a lightsaber up to this point. Like someone cutting through a blast-proof door with one, or cutting through stone like it's butter. And also just forget how originally getting run through with a lightsaber meant instant death. Just forget all that and you'll be fine. Then Sabine surviving this won't be a problem for you at all. I'm sure getting stabbed by a lightsaber would boil you alive from the inside and would be absolutely agonizing. Probably leave you with a few life-debilitating injuries, if it didn't just outright kill you instantly, like it did to these guys here. But sure, Sabine's fine, guys. The rules for this universe mean nothing anymore. Lightsabers inflict lethal wounds when the writers need them to, and non-lethal wounds also when they need them to. It's totally at the discretion of the writer. It would be nice if being at least injured by a lightsaber actually had repercussions for a character. In the older Star Wars stuff, getting on the wrong end of a lightsaber actually meant something. There was these things called consequences. Luke lost a hand. Kanan Jarrus and Ram Koda were both blinded by a lightsaber. Qui-Gon Jinn dies almost instantly after getting run through by one. Admiral Trench here dies almost instantly from being stabbed in the chest by one. Before even waving one of these in someone's general direction meant death. But the more recent Disney Star Wars stuff, forget it man. Stab, double stab, you're fine, just walk it off. The lightsaber is one of the coolest and deadliest weapons in this universe, and Disney have just nerfed it to the point where it's an absolutely meaningless weapon. So we're going to take a bit of a detour for a second and explore one of these newly introduced characters. This is Marrok. You'll probably remember him from the trailers. Pretty cool looking, right? The full-length body armor, the visor. You think the writers were setting up some kind of big reveal with this character, since they were basically going out of their way to obscure the character's identity. Was it going to be someone like Barriss Offee, a character from the Clone Wars show who once tried to frame Ahsoka for bombing the Jedi Temple? Was it going to be another character from the EU or even from one of the video games? Maybe it was Starkiller. There's a pretty strong resemblance. Was Marrok going to be a returning character from Rebels? Was it actually somehow going to be Ezra Bridger? I mean, that would have been something cool, right? If Ezra, the character Ahsoka and Sabine were trying to find, was actually this guy who was hunting them the whole time. That somehow Thrawn had managed to brainwash their friend and sent him back hunting after them. That would have been a pretty sick reveal. So who is Marrok in the end? Turns out Marrok was none of these characters. Turns out Marrok wasn't even a character at all. Marrok is actually just smoke. He's a big old bag of green smoke. That's great. That's really great. That's really something. Thanks, Dave. Thanks so much. What a great character. So if you were hoping for something more here, some big reveal, sorry about that. It was a whole bunch of setup for what turns out to be a whole lot of nothing. And I just have to ask, why? Why did Marrok have to be literally nobody? What purpose did this guy serve in the overall story? Couldn't Shin have filled this character's role instead? I mean, that would have at least given her more screen time and maybe something to actually do in this show. I just don't get the point of establishing this character as a threat and then having it turn out to be a literal bag of smoke. And yes, I've heard that this whole Marrok thing is basically Filoni calling back to some Arthurian legend about a witch who controls a knight. That's all really very smart and everything, but that does literally nothing to explain this. And I hate to use this word in this situation, but character's presence in this story. Why do we need another Force-sensitive antagonist type character in this show when the ones we do already have get next to no screen time or development? But you know what? I actually have a theory about why Filoni put this literal steam packet of a character in here. Remember earlier on in this video when I mentioned that Filoni will just set up an action sequence or a set piece even if it makes zero sense to the overall story? Well, I think Filoni basically just wanted to replicate this scene from Sanjuro, a film from director Akira Kurosawa. And shit, he's not going to sacrifice one of his new Force-sensitive villains just for that. So boom, enter Marrok, a Force-sensitive Sith-style mercenary with zero backstory and characterization, whose only purpose in the story is to get killed in this scene in this way, homaging a samurai film from 1962. If I had to guess, I'd say Dave thought this scene up and storyboarded it well before he decided who was going to fill this role in that scene. And you know man, I feel bad for all the Star Wars fans that thought there was going to be a big payoff with this character, that Mark was actually going to have this epic reveal. If you were one of those Star Wars fans that went on Reddit and made some really good arguments for why you thought Marrok could have been or should have been maybe Barriss Offee or Starkiller or even Ezra Bridger, you literally spent more time thinking about the characterization of Marrok than Dave Filoni did. Marrok, a character who probably only exists in this story solely to pay homage to a samurai film from 1962. Before we get into Sabine's decision in episode 4, I think it's necessary to provide a bit of backstory from Rebels about Thrawn and Ezra. In season 3 of Rebels, Thrawn is introduced as the new big bad of the show, replacing Darth Vader. Who is Thrawn? Well, Thrawn is Emperor Palpatine's master military strategist. He's brought in to find not one rebel cell, but the entire rebellion in season 3 of Rebels. This guy is a genius. He's a master tactician. He can interpret how sentient beings from different cultures and races will react just from understanding that being's culture and art. He's ruthless and he's always 10 steps ahead. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, Thrawn is actually an EU character. The last time we saw Thrawn in Rebels, he was bombarding the capital of Ezra Bridger's homeworld of Lothal to get the rebels to surrender. To stop this, Ezra agreed to Thrawn's terms and voluntarily boarded Thrawn's ship, only to pull a double cross on him and summon a school of Purrgil, those would be the space whales, who light-speed jumped Thrawn's ship with Ezra still on board to another galaxy. Ezra sacrificed himself to ensure that Thrawn was taken off the board and was no longer a threat to his galaxy. In the final minutes of Rebels Season 4, we find out from a video message made beforehand by Ezra that it was always his plan to sacrifice himself to take out Thrawn. He also requests Sabine to find a way to bring him back to his own galaxy. That's Sabine's primary motivation in this show. So now that you know all of that, let's talk about Sabine's actions and how they make absolutely zero sense and totally stomp all over Ezra's sacrifice from the Rebels finale. In episode 4, just after Ahsoka gets blasted off the cliff edge by Baylan, Sabine shows up and grabs a hold of the star map device. Right here, at this point, Sabine has two choices. She can either A. destroy the star map and keep her galaxy safe from Thrawn forever. The downside of this choice though is that destroying it will mean that she won't ever be able to save Ezra. Sabine can also go with option B and hand the device over to Baylan. Doing so will allow her to save Ezra, but it will also mean that she's aiding Morgan Elsbeth in bringing back Thrawn. Now keep in mind, if Sabine decides to destroy the device here, that's it. Morgan Elsbeth's plan to bring Thrawn back is totally dead in the water. She'll have no way of bringing Thrawn back. As a result, the galaxy will be safe again. And to make this decision even easier to understand, Sabine has to basically weigh the life of one singular man against the countless lives that will inevitably be lost if Thrawn gets to return to his own galaxy. And to remind you, Thrawn is the greatest living threat to this universe. He wasn't Palpatine's master military strategist for nothing. The last time we saw this guy in Rebels, he was carrying out an aerial bombardment of a populated civilian center on purpose. That's the guy you would be helping return home if you give that star map to Baylan. So what would you say our hero should do here? Well, if you guessed anything heroic, you'd be wrong. In what will go down in the in-universe Star Wars history books as one of the most selfish decisions ever made, Sabine opts for option B and sacrifices the safety of her whole galaxy just so that she can save her friend. every single person that Thrawn will go on to kill, either directly or indirectly from this point onwards, if he gets back, is 100% on Sabine. And you know what's really funny about this decision? This is exactly the same situation that the writers put Obi-Wan in the Kenobi show, when they had him spare Vader's life in that show for no reason at all. Basically making Kenobi responsible for everyone Vader will go on to kill. I just find it really funny that Filoni is cribbing possibly the worst idea from Kenobi, the most hated decision to come out of that show, and he's incorporating it here with Sabine. Let's skip on to the end. You don't need me to recap the episodes between this stupid decision and the finale. Ahsoka, Sabine and Ezra rush the pillar. Oh yeah, they find Ezra by the way, and it's mad underwhelming. Where Thrawn is loading his ship, somehow managing to not even get grazed by this aerial bombardment that they're riding directly under. They encounter what I guess you could call resistance. More on these guys later. Making it to the top of the tower, where Sabine uses her never-before-seen Jedi abilities to force push Ezra onto Thrawn's departing ship, leaving herself and Ahsoka trapped, but not really, on Peridea. And that's that. Mission accomplished, guys. They've managed to save Ezra and send him home. All's well that ends well. Alright, let's take a more critical look at this outcome. Ezra is now aboard Thrawn's ship, and they're both on their way back to their home galaxy. But what does that mean when you think about it? Well, if you're a citizen on any planet in the galaxy Thrawn is right now speeding his way back to, it means nothing good. In fact, it means another galactic war if Thrawn's final comments before lightspeed jumping away are anything to go by. And just so all this is totally clear, Sabine and Ahsoka have just swapped places with Ezra and Thrawn on Peridea, which ultimately means that Ezra's sacrifice at the end of Rebels only bought the galaxy 10 years of peace from Thrawn, when it was originally meant to stop Thrawn outright. But somehow both Sabine and Ahsoka act as if this was a great outcome. Somehow everyone is totally happy with this, including Ezra, who I would have thought would have been totally outraged by what Sabine did, you know, considering he sacrificed 10 years of his life and was willing to sacrifice the rest of it to keep Thrawn where he was, and Sabine's just come in and totally undone his plan. But instead, the last 10 minutes of this show has this everything is just the way it needs to be vibe going on. You know, if Filoni was being honest with you here about how these two characters should be in this scene at the very end, both of them should be out of their minds with guilt and fear and remorse for basically enabling the return of the galaxy's biggest monster. If Sabine had in fact done nothing, the galaxy would be in an infinitely better place right now. Because of, not in spite of Sabine's decisions, the galaxy is now not one step closer to another galactic war, it's about 10,000 steps closer to one. How could anyone think that's a good thing? Ahsoka says to Sabine at the end, Ezra is where he needs to be, and so are we. Well, how do you figure that? How is you being stranded on this planet the right place for you to be, when the greatest threat to your galaxy is right now, at this very moment, speeding back as fast as possible to probably kick off another war that will probably go on to kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, a lot of them innocent civilians? How could anyone think this was a favourable outcome? And I'm including Dave Filoni in this. This whole story and how the protagonists act totally falls apart if you give it 30 seconds of thought. Even the stakes set up at the very end are meaningless. I mean, Ahsoka and Sabine are meant to be stranded on Peridea, right? But are they though? How are they stranded there? Ahsoka used the space whales to get here. Why can't she use them to leave again? What was set up in this show that would prevent her from doing just that? The writing is just so illogical here. This whole story feels like a first draft with zero revisions. A lot of the issues with this story honestly could have been fixed if the script was handed off to a few other people to read over and provide some critical feedback on. And look, I like Dave Filoni. I love Clone Wars and Rebels. But I think after having watched Ahsoka, his strengths are best used on overseeing projects, in a producer capacity. You might think this is an unnecessary dig at Filoni, and it's not. But when I was watching Ahsoka, it reminded me of Taika Waititi directing Thor Love and Thunder, and how sometimes a writer or director should have some constraints placed on them. Someone around them, probably a few people, to say no to them. It's pretty evident from these scripts that Filoni should have been co-plotting them with someone else, someone who would have seen these glaring plot holes, someone who would have challenged him on some of these creative decisions, someone to push him into writing a better, more cohesive story. No character is getting out of this show without getting tarnished by the writing, and Thrawn's no exception. Actually, he's probably the one that gets it the worst, considering he's meant to be the new big bad for Star Wars. Man, I had so many hopes for this show. Jesus, where to start? Thrawn's tactics and strategies don't make any sense. if you want to sell me on Thrawn as the new big bad, if you want to get him over as a legitimate threat, then he needs to be an actual legitimate threat, and I'm not seeing anything from him in this show that would lead me to believe that he is. His tactics and strategizing, the thing he is famous for, his main thing, the most important part of the character, makes zero sense in this show. Several times throughout this show, Thrawn's commands contradict themselves and fly in the face of traditional logic. Here's an example. In the last episode, Thrawn scrambles 2 TIE fighters, and only 2 mind you, to engage Ahsoka's ship. Even though both TIEs get destroyed, they still manage to cripple Ahsoka's ship. So what's Thrawn's next step here, would you say? I guess the conventional wisdom would be that you would order in more TIEs to blast the downed ship from the air. But this isn't what Thrawn does. For some reason he sends in a ground assault team, even though he's conscious of resources and manpower. And what happens to that ground assault team? Yeah, take a guess. I mentioned how Thrawn was really conscious about wasting resources on stopping Ahsoka and Sabine. That's not really sound logic either though. If you're in the final stages of your plan, why are you saving your resources? What are you saving them for? You need to be throwing your resources at your enemies to make sure they don't stop you. Why is resource management suddenly a priority? The success of your mission is the priority. Making sure you get off Peridia is your priority. What are you doing? None of this makes any sense. There's also other things that Thrawn does in this show that just don't add up either, like using Sabine to find Ezra, which he's also able to do in under half a day of searching. Thrawn's been here for like 10 years. Dave, do you know how silly this makes your new big bad look? Also, did Thrawn just not think of using the Great Mothers to find Ezra in all this time? They found Ahsoka with near pinpoint accuracy when she was hiding. Also, why is Ezra a priority to find now anyway, when he wasn't for the last 10 years? You're leaving this planet in a matter of hours. Why are you wasting your time and some of your people on this? Oh yeah, and to make Thrawn look even worse, he also allows Sabine to have her lightsaber back. Sabine would later go on to use this very same lightsaber to cut down a bunch of Thrawn's own men. He could have just not given this back to her, or better yet, he could have just killed her. Here's another one. Thrawn's on a deadline in the last episode trying to get the mysterious cargo on board his ship. Why didn't he just have it on board already? He's been on Peridia for 10 years. Why is he only loading it now? See, the problem with Thrawn in this show is that he's only as smart as the writing allows him to be, and well, shit, the writing in this show isn't very smart, which is a big roadblock when the new big bad you're trying to establish is meant to be this next level intellect. And you know, for all of Thrawn's planning and smart resource management and all that, he's literally being hounded by Ahsoka and Sabine right up to the second he jumps to lightspeed. He barely gets away here. Every obstacle he throws at Ahsoka, Sabine and Ezra does basically nothing to stop them. I feel he just got away by sheer luck at the end and not through anything he actually did. You know, Timothy Zahn, the guy who created Thrawn and wrote the beloved Thrawn trilogy, he's still around. In fact, he's still writing the character today for the new Disney canon. Maybe it wouldn't have been a bad idea to bring him in this last episode. Maybe have him come up with some really smart plan Thrawn could use. Some really smart strategy he could deploy. Just a thought. Here's the thing, if you're going to sell audiences on this guy being the next level threat, he needs to be keeping our heroes on the back foot, keeping them reacting to him and not the other way around. You need to open strong with a new villain early on if you want people to take him seriously. You know that saying, you only get one chance at a first impression? Well, that goes double for introducing a villain. You need a strong opening. You need the villain to be taken seriously. You need that one big moment where the villain does something shocking. You remember that scene from Infinity War where Thanos shows up all decked out in his armor and just bodies the Hulk in hand-to-hand combat after torturing Thor, a literal god, in front of Loki, who a few minutes later he literally crushes the life out of. That's how you establish a villain as a major threat. That's how you get the audience to sit up and pay attention. Where's Thrawn's big Thanos moment in Ahsoka? What does he do in the time that we get to see him to show us how dangerous he is? Oh yeah, that's right, nothing. I was positive at one point Filoni was going to have Thrawn murk someone important just to make a point of showing how bad of a guy Thrawn could be. Maybe Ezra, since he was the one who got him stranded on Peridia in the first place. But no, Thrawn is literally scrambling, barely keeping our heroes off of him for pretty much all of his screen time. And there's another thing I want to mention here about how Thrawn is portrayed. I don't like commenting on an actor's appearance, but Thrawn is supposed to be a guy who keeps himself in shape, and he's not shown as that here. The writers on Rebels went out of their way to show that Thrawn wasn't just a threat tactically, but also physically as well. He can handle himself. He's a skilled hand-to-hand fighter and he keeps himself in shape. Thrawn being out of shape like he is here just feels so out of character for him, and it speaks to how, in this show, character traits and important characteristics are just being ignored or not even considered at all. Another really glaring example of this is that "Long live the Empire" line that Thrawn says right before light speeding away. This doesn't really jive with Thrawn's motivations in the new in-continuity novels. Thrawn works for the Empire, but he's loyal to the Chiss ascendancy. Palpatine's dream was not Thrawn's dream. Just another example of Filoni stomping all over another writer's work because he either doesn't know what the other divisions are doing with these characters in this shared universe or doesn't care. Probably the latter. You know, Disney went out of their way to clarify Thrawn's new motivation in several commissioned books. It'd be great if Disney, and by extension Filoni, could at least try and pretend the supplementary media matters. Disney are pretty happy to rake in, I'm guessing, a not inconsiderable sum of money every year from the fans who go out and buy their Star Wars comics and books and games, and yet this content is always the first thing to be thrown out whenever a film or a TV series gets made. It's not even a consideration for the creatives to make sure the continuity is aligned across everything anymore. It's like they just couldn't be bothered, underlying what they really think of all the books and the comics that they release. You know, I'm not totally against this idea. Stormtroopers don't pose any kind of threat in Star Wars at all, to the point that their inability to shoot straight is an in-universe joke. So if Filoni wants to implement an idea here to give these guys back some edge and actually make them into a legitimate threat going forward, then I'm all for it. The only problem I have with this idea here is basically how it's implemented. Ahsoka, Ezra and Sabine clear a room full of stormtroopers with not really too much effort, and then after a few moments the dispatched stormtroopers reanimate. But here in this scene, it's not like the zombified stormtroopers are posing any more of a threat to Ahsoka, Ezra and Sabine after they've been reanimated. I mean, if anything, they're just a little bit slower now, easier to cut down. I guess they're stronger now, or maybe that's just these guys, I don't know. This scene doesn't really do anything to sell me on the idea that this is somehow a new game-changing event and the old way of combating stormtroopers won't work anymore. I just don't see how them being zombies makes them any more threatening or any more dangerous than they were when they were alive. If you're going to implement something like this, then you have to show how stormtroopers reanimating as zombies changes how our protagonists engage with them. If you want to sell me on zombie stormtroopers, then show me something. Make them fast, make them less susceptible to damage. Do something frightening. At the very least, do something visually interesting with them. Lose the helmets and show me someone getting torn in half or gored by one of them. Give me something other than them just crumpling like regular stormtroopers when they meet the business end of a lightsaber. They're zombies. Maybe lean into the whole horror angle bit. Maybe in the future this idea will get fleshed out a bit more, but right now, it's not doing too much for me. Here's one really massive problem this show has from a writing perspective. You'll get a lot more out of Ahsoka if you've seen Clone Wars and Rebels, and by a lot more, I mean you'll at least understand the story and some of the character motivations and who Ezra Bridger is and what he did and why to stop Thrawn. But if you haven't seen Rebels, you have no idea who Ezra Bridger is and why you should care about him. Needing to know about Rebels is kind of built into the show's foundation, and that's not a problem for fans of Rebels like myself, but it's a massive problem if you're just a regular dude sitting down to watch Ahsoka week to week. This show does basically nothing to characterize Ezra. You never get a sense of who this guy is, you never learn anything about him from what little screen time he does have. His history with Sabine, Ahsoka and Hera is never detailed with anything even approaching depth. But yet somehow, a regular person is meant to get the feels from watching these two characters, Ezra and Sabine, one of whom they've never seen before in their life, reconnect after 10 years apart. I understand the weight of this scene because I watched these two characters across 4 seasons of Rebels. To the average person though, this scene means absolutely nothing. Sabine is just meeting some rando that's barely been mentioned up until now. And that's true for this scene between Hera and Ezra too. Also, why does he keep his helmet on here? I mean, I'm guessing he's alone on this ship. Did he spend the whole journey just wearing the helmet all this time? It's really odd. Like, why would you walk down this ramp with this on? You could get your head blown off for that. I mean, what are general audiences expected to feel in this scene when Huyang gives Ezra this lightsaber component and explains it's twinned with another component in the lightsaber of his old master, Kanan Jarrus? Sure, I know who Kanan Jarrus is, but to anyone not familiar with Rebels, They're watching what's meant to be a sentimental moment for Ezra, a character they barely even know at this point, reminisce about his master, a character they've never even met. Any emotional weight these scenes may have had is totally reliant on the audience's familiarity with a show that went off the air 5 years ago. I just really have to question how Filoni thought any of this stuff would be impactful to anyone who hasn't seen Rebels. It's like he never thought it was important to build Ezra up in the 7 episodes leading up to this reunion. Ezra is actually the character who needed and would have benefited the most from some flashback sequences. A few flashbacks over the course of the season would go a long way to explaining why Sabine would risk the safety of the universe to find him. With some flashback sequences, you're building up Ezra for new viewers and they can get a sense of who the guy is and maybe form an attachment to him. And you're also strengthening Sabine's motivation because, through these flashbacks, you can see her relationship with Ezra and why it's so important to her to find him. And as an added bonus, you're also giving some context to her decision to hand over the star map to Baylan. Of course, no relationship, no matter how special, could justify Sabine putting the whole galaxy in danger, but at least it would be something. Characterization just feels like a total afterthought here. It's either totally absent, like with Ezra, or totally nonsensical, like with Ahsoka. Speaking about absent characterization, let's talk about Baylan Skull and Shin Hati. Don't worry, it won't take long, there really isn't all that much to discuss. So Baylan and Shin are the new antagonists, and from the trailers I was actually interested in these two. They weren't Sith, they weren't Jedi, they landed somewhere in the middle, and I thought this might lead to them having a pretty interesting dynamic with Ahsoka, considering she's not a Jedi either. But oh boy was I wrong. Both of these new characters get next to nothing to do, and I'd be surprised if Shin actually gets to say 5 lines of dialogue throughout the whole 8 episode run. Baylan actually has the potential to be a really interesting character from what little we do learn about him. He was a Jedi Knight before Order 66, but became disillusioned with it. He somehow knows that Anakin went on to become Vader, maybe even knew him personally before he went bad. He found Shin when she was younger and raised her with his own ideology. He's got his own mission, which is only ever vaguely hinted at. There's some interesting stuff here that honestly could have been worked into a better show than the one we ended up getting, but none of it gets any exploration. All the interesting stuff is just vaguely hinted at, which is actually one of the biggest misses in this show. Not to bring the tone of the video down or anything, but I want to take a second and just acknowledge the tragic passing of Ray Stevenson this year. From what little we do see of Ray Stevenson in this show, he really elevates every scene he's in here. Gone far too soon at only 58 years old. R.I.P. Ray Stevenson, you will be missed. So episode 5. This was lauded as the best episode of the season by many Twitter users, so that's not a great endorsement already. However, out of the whole 8 episode run of the show, it's easily the episode with the most going for it. It's the episode that gives the most focus to Ahsoka. She gets so little to do in her own show, it's actually incredible. It's got Hayden Christensen back in the role of Anakin, and it's got those Clone Wars flashbacks that the Kenobi series should have had but didn't for some reason. This episode had a lot going on, and usually an episode like this, tightly focused on a single character while they work through a problem or some dilemma, would be my jam, but here Filoni kind of falls down in his execution of the episode. So I'll set the stage. Ahsoka gets an earful from Baylan right before he blasts her off the cliff edge here, about her legacy, and this results in Ahsoka going through what has to be the fastest character arc probably in all of fiction. It's literally a whole 8 episodes worth of character growth jam-packed into one single episode. And none of it makes any sense. And the result of this accelerated character arc, Ahsoka comes out the other side of this episode having accepted life with a renewed passion to stop Thrawn, and I guess she also wants to train Sabine now for some reason. And to reflect this shift in Ahsoka's character, she's now decked out in white robes. That's all great, but there's one problem with this whole arc. We, and by that I mean the audience, had no idea that Ahsoka was going through any crisis of faith or existential dilemma about her role in the universe or her legacy pretty much up until it was resolved. I couldn't understand throughout this episode, why was Anakin asking her to choose between life and death? I was thinking, where is this coming from and where is it actually leading to? So what brought about this whole crisis of faith in the first place? It wasn't something she was actively dealing with in the 3 previous episodes. No, it was actually set up in the last 5 minutes of episode 4 with just one line of dialogue that Baylan said when he was duking it out with her. Your legacy, like your master's, is one of death and destruction. That's it. That's the setup for this whole character arc. This one line of dialogue, said maybe 30 seconds before she was blasted off a cliff edge. That was the setup for this whole episode's worth of character growth. If you want Ahsoka to go on a journey of self-discovery, where she works through a crisis and comes out the other side recommitting to her mission with a renewed sense of purpose, that's great, and I'm here for that, but you need to build something like that up over time. You need to show the character actually grappling with the problem. You need to see the weight of the dilemma on them, weighing them down, preferably over the course of a few episodes. You can't just set something like that up with one line of dialogue 30 seconds before exploring it. It's like Dave just forgot that Ahsoka needed to have an arc in her own show and only realised after 4 episodes. For a number of reasons, this line of dialogue really shouldn't have had any effect on her anyway. If you've watched the Clone Wars, and you know the character's history, you already know Ahsoka's legacy isn't one of death and destruction. What Baylan's describing here sounds more like Anakin's legacy. I don't understand how suddenly death and destruction is Ahsoka's legacy. Of course people die in war, and Ahsoka is a soldier, but that's not on her. She is and always has been fighting a war on the side of the Angels. Sure, she's had to kill, but only bad people fighting on the wrong side, and then that was to stop a greater evil or prevent a larger loss of life and basically halt the spread of what she thought was tyranny. The war might not have been black and white, but there's no ambiguity about Ahsoka's role in it. She's one of the good guys. I mean, if anyone in this show should be worried about their legacy, it's Sabine. But this whole arc that Ahsoka goes through isn't the only part of the episode that's making me scratch my head. I'm just generally confused by Anakin's presence here. Like, what even is he? Is he a Force ghost? Is he Ahsoka's hallucination? Is he whatever Han Solo was when he appeared to Kylo Ren in The Rise of Skywalker? Is this whole thing just a dream? I mean, if he was a Force ghost, he'd have that astral projection, transparent look to him, right? But he doesn't have that here, and he can be physically touched as well, so I guess he's not a Force ghost. But then, what is he? Cause he sure as shit isn't a hallucination, considering that other people outside the world between worlds can hear him clashing lightsabers with Ahsoka. And this whole situation never gets explained. What makes it even more confusing is that throughout this episode, there's flashes of Anakin's Vader personality. Like, we get these shots of Vader's silhouette every now and again, and we see Anakin with his yellow Sith eyes. And I mean, is he showing her this stuff? And if so, why? Or is this Ahsoka imagining this stuff? This honestly feels more like a dream sequence. But we've already established this can't be a dream because Hera can hear Ahsoka and Anakin fighting. It feels like Filoni just wanted these two characters to engage in a fight, and he's just inventing this new meta state, I guess, where he can have that happen. And because it really doesn't make any sense, he just doesn't bother even trying to explain any of it. And one more thing, why does Ahsoka have Sith eyes for like 2 seconds? That's just introduced and then it's never brought up again. I mean, what was the point of that? We didn't see Ahsoka grappling with the dark side before this. We don't see her grappling with it afterwards either. It's just there for a second and then never touched on again. And the wider implications of this scene are really game-breaking too. I mean, if Anakin can, as a Force ghost, I'm calling him a Force ghost here because I really don't know what else to call him, can just pull Ahsoka out of danger at any moment and into the world between worlds, then it's hard to worry about her ever being in any real danger ever again. I mean, Anakin is dead. He's out of the story in an active sense. Dead characters, and by dead I mean Force ghosts, can pop up from time to time in Star Wars, sure, but in a passive capacity. They'll give advice to the protagonist, but they're not guardian angels. They're not there to just pull a character out of a life or death situation. They shouldn't be able to influence the story to this degree. And before you jump into the comments and say, oh well, Ezra Bridger pulled Ahsoka out of her fight with Vader and Rebels, this is practically the same thing. And yeah, he did, but Ezra isn't whatever Anakin is here in these scenes. He's not omnipotent. Ezra doesn't have the access to the world between worlds on a whim, so he can just pull someone out of a life or death situation whenever they're about to get killed. I mean, just think about what Filoni has put on the table here. Anakin, a dead character, just pulled Ahsoka out of a life or death situation on a whim. So what's preventing him from doing this again? Like say if Ahsoka is in another duel in Season 2. Do you see how difficult it's going to be for future writers to write around something like this? And you can apply this to any Jedi Master and Apprentice now as well going forward. If in Ahsoka Season 2, Thrawn manages to get the upper hand on Ezra, don't worry about it. Long dead character Kanan Jarrus can just get up out of his cold dark grave and pull Ezra to safety, not a bother. Again, Filoni just wants to have a scene between Anakin and Ahsoka, but wasn't content to have that scene play out in a way that makes sense with the existing rules of this universe. So he decides to just break those rules, not caring that, in doing so, it undermines the logic of this universe and puts every writer coming after him in a position where they need to now write around this massive problem he's just created. And that just feels so selfish to me. And there was ways around this too. Filoni could have just written this entire scene between Ahsoka and Anakin as a hallucination or a dream sequence, or better yet, as a flashback. Tied this whole arc that Ahsoka is going through to a lesson she remembers learning from Anakin during the Clone Wars. You'd still get to keep the young Anakin and Ahsoka Clone Wars scenes together, and you wouldn't need to stomp all over the rules and mechanics of your universe to have it make sense. What would have been wrong with that? Oh yeah, I know, it would mean that Filoni would have to accommodate his writing to the rules of the universe, and not the other way around, and shit, he wasn't going to start doing something like that, was he? With a little bit more effort and creativity, Filoni could have had these scenes make sense, but it's like he just couldn't be bothered trying to make it all work within the existing rules of the universe. Again, just really baffling story choices and decisions on full display for everyone to see here. You can't just keep bending and in some cases breaking the rules of a universe. You can't just write a scene between Ahsoka and Anakin without also explaining it. Bare minimum, this stuff has to make sense. It might be a sci-fi fantasy universe, but you still have to be consistent with your rules and how you implement them. If you're not, then nothing matters. You'd think after all the blowback Disney caught for all the world-breaking mechanics introduced in the sequels, the higher-ups would at least try to rein in their writers and stop them from introducing anything else that would break the logic of this universe even further. But no, instead Filoni is allowed to just go hog wild with his own show here, introducing new world-breaking mechanic after world-breaking mechanic like it's nothing. Let's just look at some of the totally game-breaking mechanics that Filoni introduces here and the implications of these new mechanics for this universe going forward. Witches can now just pinpoint exactly where any character is at any given time. Knock-on effect to future stories. Basically, no one is ever safe in this universe from the Empire now. No rebel force could ever establish a secret base to operate out of without the Empire knowing about it instantly and destroying it. Long-dead characters can now return as near omnipotent gods. Knock-on effect to future stories. Previously dead characters can now appear at any time and pull living characters out of imminent life-threatening danger. So anytime a character dies from this point onwards, you'll be left wondering, why didn't Anakin or another long-dead Jedi just pull them into the world between worlds before they were killed? Anyone can be a Force user now, even if they haven't ever shown to be in any way Force sensitive up to this point. This is probably the most egregious example of Filoni's writing. What's the knock-on effect of this? I don't think I really need to explain this one, this just totally breaks the universe. Look, the Force is a nebulous concept, and honestly it works best that way. I always understood the Force to be this totally random thing. I never liked the idea of midichlorians or really any story device brought in to make sense of it. The Force just is. It's ancient, it permeates everything, and it's completely unknowable. And that's what's great about it. I don't need to know how the Force works in the same way I don't need to know how the X gene gives the X-Men their powers. It just does. Maybe 1 in 1 billion sentient beings would be able to wield the Force, and there would be no reason for why that one individual above anyone else would be able to. This was actually one of the traits I really liked from The Last Jedi before it was abandoned in The Rise of Skywalker. That Rey was in fact a nobody. She wasn't descended from some famous Jedi lineage. And that was the beauty of the Force. You didn't have to be anyone important. You could be a total nobody and you could have these Force powers. But now anyone can just have Force powers if they just practice enough, I guess. This is probably the best example of why Dave Filoni needs, not should have, but needs to have someone to bounce his story ideas off of. Someone to reinforce that not every single idea he has is a good one. Filoni wanted Sabine to have Force powers. It doesn't matter if it contradicts 4 seasons of another show entirely. It doesn't matter if it totally breaks the rules of this universe. Dave's decreed that Sabine's a Force sensitive now, so that's that. That's just so arrogant. Like, who are you to make or break these rules? Who are you to decide what rules are important and which ones can just be cast aside and ignored because they prevent you from doing something you want to do with a character? Story rules. Yeah, they exist for a reason. The mechanics of a fictional world, there's a reason as a writer you need to respect those. You know why? Because as a writer, if you can just break those rules and have your characters do whatever you want them to, there are no more stakes. There's no more tension and nothing matters because anything can just be changed the minute it becomes too inconvenient for you as a writer. Jesus man, like, is anyone actually keeping tabs on the LucasArts writing room at Disney, like, at all? Shouldn't there be like a committee that a writer has to run these scripts and story ideas past? It just seems like any writer can just do whatever they want with this IP now. You want lightspeed skipping in your movie? You want characters to just pull new abilities out of seemingly nowhere whenever the story calls for it? Do you want previously dead characters to return with new powers and almost omnipotent agency? Do you want your characters to just be able to instantly heal themselves and also others from what were previously fatal wounds? Sure, go for it. Forget story cohesion, none of that matters. I liked seeing Anakin again and also seeing the Clone Wars in live action. But you know what I'm not going to do? I'm not going to allow that brief moment of nostalgia I had for better written shows to positively colour my opinion of this poorly written one. And you shouldn't either. I'm not going to let a writer off the hook for stomping all over the characters, history and mechanics of this world just so he could do whatever he wanted, just because he jingled some keys in my face. And I'm certainly not going to go on Twitter and proclaim that this is peak Star Wars because I got to see young Anakin and Ahsoka fight side by side for 5 minutes. I'm not going to proclaim this show as the start of a new era for Star Wars when I feel I spent more time thinking about the story and the characters for this video than the actual writer did. You can't just throw young Anakin and scenes from the Clone Wars at people and think that that alone will be enough to carry the day. You have to be more creative than that. You can't just rely on member berries to get you through, and I feel that's what the writers are doing now with this IP. Ever since that Luke cameo at the end of Mando Season 2, they're just substituting smart and creative writing with cameos and nostalgia. Having Anakin here and going back to the Clone Wars just feels like misdirection, like a magician distracting you with one hand while he hides a deck of cards up his sleeve with the other. You'll be so dazzled by seeing Anakin show up in his animated Clone Wars costume and seeing him fight alongside young Ahsoka in live action that you'll just forget or even won't notice that this story makes absolutely no sense, that this character arc Ahsoka is going through was set up with just one line of dialogue in the last 10 minutes of the previous episode because the writer couldn't be bothered to tread it through the previous episodes leading up to it. You'll be so happy to see C-3PO again, you won't even notice that some of the new characters created for this show are so underdeveloped you know about as much about them now after finishing the show as you did the first time you saw them in the trailer. You might not even notice that some characters don't serve a point at all in this story and might as well not even be here. I think Filoni can be a creative guy. I love his Clone Wars and Rebels stuff, but I'm not going to say that this was his best work when it really wasn't. I went back to the 4-episode Siege of Mandalore arc for this video, and yeah, it's great, and it still holds up, which just makes me so curious as to what happened here with his Ahsoka show. There's a night and day difference here in terms of writing quality. Honestly, it feels like both of these projects were written by two different people. Ahsoka isn't just bad Star Wars, it's bad storytelling, it's poor writing. It doesn't even try to make sense or be consistent. There's holes in the plot that you could drive an articulated lorry through. The whole thing feels lazy. I have a hard time believing that Dave Filoni could be happy with this story or feel that he served these characters well with it. Not to totally trash the show, the performances across the board are really good. You've got a great cast here, but their talents are largely wasted with what they've been given in this show. In particular, Rosario Dawson, she's perfect for Ahsoka, but for some reason Dave gives her so little to do in her own show, she feels almost like a secondary character a lot of the time. Lars Mikkelsen is also a great pick for a live-action Thrawn. He's putting in a lot of effort here, but his character ends up getting hamstrung by the writing. What should have been the next great Star Wars villain ends up only as a passable threat, a pale imitation of a much better EU character. Eman Esfandi has star power written all over him. He's got mad charisma as Ezra Bridger, but the character of Ezra just feels like a total afterthought in this show, when he could have been a standout character with better material. When you have a cast this great, you need to give them great material to work with. Honestly, the cast being as good as it is only adds to the frustration I feel with this show. Like I said at the start, this show had so much potential, and it all gets squandered by the weak and nonsensical scripts that Filoni went with here. As I'm writing this, the news broke that Dave was promoted to Chief Creative Officer overseeing all things Star Wars at Disney. Even a few months ago, I would have been so happy to hear that, but after watching Ahsoka, I'm not so sure about this decision. Star Wars is a shared universe, creatively speaking. A lot of writers work across the comics and the books and the games, and what really worries me is how little regard Filoni has for the work of these other writers. With Ahsoka, I honestly feel Dave thinks that Star Wars is just his sandbox to play in, to implement whatever ideas he wants. I can only see that tendency becoming worse now that he's in a position with complete creative oversight over the brand. Like I said, Filoni is at his strongest when he's overseeing a project in a producer or supervisory capacity, so maybe it's not a totally terrible idea, but for it to work out, I think he'll need to be surrounded by people that will actually challenge him, because letting him do whatever he wants, giving him free rein to run with every harebrained idea, that actually might be the final nail in the Star Wars coffin, creatively speaking. But what do you think? What were your opinions on Ahsoka? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching.